Orthodoxy is the second largest group of Christians in the world. And this is what I love about kind of the Orthodox Church too, is man is seen as like priest of the cosmos. And like, that's the function that we should be living out. So that's all the animals and like through man, everything is kind of assimilated together in a way that, you know, starts this kind of redemptive process.
I remember Father John Ellis saying, you know, if you want to learn about Orthodoxy, go to church. Like,
yeah,
it's not about reading a book or, you know, like learning in your head. It's about experiencing the liturgy and smelling the incense and, you know, hearing the chants and seeing all the paintings and like being with people and sharing food.
Let me back up. For 1,000 years, and like a lot of people just don't realize this, the church was one body. They dropped a bull of excommunication at Constantinople on the altar and were like, we're done. And then we were like, well, we're done with you. And then there was kind of a tragic split.
This is the Lifted Spirits Podcast, where we raise a glass, share encouraging thoughts and stories, and discuss how we find meaning through family, friendship, business, art, and everything in between. Today, I'm interviewing Scott Strickland, who is on the path to becoming a priest in the Eastern Orthodox Church, which I didn't even know was a thing till I was like 19, because most people in Eastern Orthodoxy are non-white, and we didn't learn about that growing up in good old American Christianity. It's the second biggest church in the world, so hopefully this conversation is enlightening and teaches you about a new sphere of the religious world.
This is Scott, and we've known you for like, what, seven or 8 years now? Something
Probably
like that.
longer
Ever since
than
we got
that,
married,
maybe.
or since we got engaged, so it's been a minute.
Yeah.
And before I get into a lot of questions, I like asking people, what's the best thing that's happened to you in the past few weeks?
The past few weeks, that's tough. I mean, definitely high on the list would be, well, I technically haven't graduated yet, but turning in everything for my thesis that I was working on, turning that in, emailing all the professors, and like closing that door. I think the actual graduation is like sometime in the fall.
Yeah.
But turning all that in, that being like off my chest, and then like feeling accomplished, but like not like, oh, I did this great thing, but like, hey, it's finally done. Like it's, yeah. So I think that, and then probably just like family time. We were with my wife's family recently, and we did like crystal digging in hot springs, and yeah, that was a lot of fun. I think I enjoyed it more than the kids did, actually.
Yeah.
But yeah.
I can relate. I only buy toys for our kids if I'm going to play with them. And I specifically, it doesn't matter how many times we tell our parents or friends, like, don't get our kids toys for Christmas or for birthdays, because then we just end up with, I mean, you can't see on camera, but like there's just a pile, or it's not a pile because it's all in these little quadrants, but it's just too much. And that's not even all of it. There's a bunch in the garage. And yeah, it's like, this is America. Plastic toys everywhere.
Accumulation,
and then I also I think people focus a lot on identify themselves with what they do and things like that. But I like the question said, what do you like? What are you like? So if you had to describe yourself, how would you describe yourself?
If I had to describe myself, definitely artistic, or creative, maybe might be a better word. Creative, but in like a problem solving kind of way. And then, you know, the word spiritual is kind of weird, but, you know, spiritual, you know, just got my degree in theology. And so whatever you want to call that, I think those are kind of the two sides of me in a way, the creative side, and then, you know, and they're not like divided or whatever, but yeah, I would say both of those, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then now, I guess getting more into what do you do? Like, you just finished this whole program.
Yeah.
What's your whole spiel? Who are you?
Yeah. So I'm Scott. Yeah. So basically, I don't want to talk too long, but I've been
I mean, that's the point.
I've been a graphic designer, art director. I'm currently senior art director just because I've been doing it for so long. For I think it's 15, coming up on 15 years now. I've worked in advertising. I've worked for like more kind of boutique-y like design shops. I've worked for a production company for several years, so I'm used to the cameras and the light boxes and all that stuff. And so yeah, so that's kind of been my trajectory for the past 15 years. Currently work for an advertising agency. But yeah, I'm transitioning kind of out of that, God willing, into more of kind of the church world. I just completed a 3-year program at the Antiochian House of Studies. And then I opted to do a thesis paper as well in order to earn my master's in theological studies. So it's mainly been distance learning, but I've had to go to Pennsylvania a couple of times in person and do like, lectures and classes and all that stuff. So I just finished that up. And so
what would you say was the biggest takeaway from that? Obviously, to take an entire educational experience and boil it down into one takeaway, or a few, but like some of the biggest things that you feel like either really changed your perspective or changed how you were doing something in your life.
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, even though the time was short, like during the it wasn't called a retreat. What's the terminology for that? When I would go to, on campus and like be with other students, I think that time was super valuable because, you could kind of compare notes with other students as far as like where they were on their spiritual journey, where they were like, discerning like the priesthood or the diaconate. There's a lot of, like Arab students or, people from different cultures, multiple jurisdictions. So you had like Serbian and like all these different guys kind of coming in, and females too. And so that was really good. But yeah, as far as kind of ultimate learnings, reading, I read a lot of Vladimir Lossky, and so his work was really kind of influential for me.
Who is?
Yeah. So, Russian kind of, I guess you'd probably call him a theologian, wrote, about, kind of Orthodox Christian, like, dogmatics and theology, and really kind of succinctly breaks down kind of the Orthodox concept of like theosis, or in the Protestant world, like sanctification, this idea that like we're kind of growing ever closer to God in this kind of natural kind of progression. He kind of breaks it down in a way that's like really amazing. It all kind of culminates in like man is a microcosm, and like kind of we've fallen from such a amazing state, like not only the state that we were in like in the garden, but even bigger than that, like now that Christ has come, however you want to put it, like paid the price for our sins or whatever, like with that kind of new things have been opened, and we can kind of participate in that. So so that was kind of an eye opener for me. But yeah, it's been great.
Yeah, and zooming out, because to your whole program and Eastern Orthodoxy in general and the Orthodox Church, I didn't even know there was such a thing. I grew up in church, and I heard about the Orthodox Church when I was 19 or 20 or something like that.
Before I did, yeah.
It's the second biggest church in the world.
Right.
And it's just like, oh, but it's not mostly white people, so we don't know about it.
Right.
And so
True.
why don't you, I know you're not like an official representative of the
Yeah.
Orthodox Church. Why don't you just give a, give the DL on like what is
Yeah.
Orthodoxy?
Yeah. So Orthodoxy, I'll do my best. But yeah, Orthodoxy is the second largest group of Christians in the world. First, Roman Catholic Church, definitely the biggest. Then you have the Orthodox Church. So, I would say it's like Catholicism. It is a traditional representation of Christianity, following tradition, in contrast with, there's contrast with Catholicism. So, back in 1054, okay, let me back up. For 1,000 years, and like a lot of people just don't realize this, the church was one body. You had 5 central kind of locations, or kind of patriarchates. I always forget one of them, but it was Jerusalem, Alexandria, Antioch, Constantinople, and there's
Somewhere else.
there's one I'm forgetting. Yeah, there's a missing one.
America.
So America,
right?
not America. So you had 5 centers, and so that was the church for like 1,000 years. And the Bible was like coming into existence, but like it took 500 years, 600 years or something for like Scripture to finally be like, kind of codified or whatever, and like all put into the canon and all that. But so the church was going for that long, and then 1054, the Orthodox Church kind of split from the Catholic Church. So for a variety of reasons, the Turks were coming in, and the Catholic Church was like, "Oh man, we gotta beef up. We gotta protect ourselves," because understandably. And so they got, and at least in the Orthodox opinion, they got a little bit big for their britches, and were like, okay, we're the top dogs now. Like, so where it was before, very kind of like, I don't know if you want to say like egalitarian or more like kind of equal in standing. There was no one church that was kind of, Constantinople was like kind of above everybody else a little bit. But one church center wasn't, above everyone else. So, but then at least in our opinion, Catholics might disagree. I don't know. But yeah, so they excommunicated, they dropped a bull of excommunication at Constantinople on the altar, and we're like, we're done. And then we were like, well, we're done with you. And then there was kind of a tragic split. And so, whereas Catholicism is known in the West, the Orthodox Church is largely kind of unknown, because there was no Reformation. It just kept on going. And so you still see those centers of Greece, Russia, Ukraine, Africa, kind of all kind of in the East. You see those centers. It came to the U.S. in the late 1700s, early 1800s by the Russians primarily, kind of coming into Alaska and all of that. But yeah, so, but to get back kind of a little bit on kind of doctrine and all of that. So similar to Catholicism in some of those kind of basic doctrines, but also not. So the creed has differences for sure. In Orthodoxy, there's no pope, there's no like one sole leader that's like infallible or what have you. And so, yeah, just keeping with early church tradition, regarding like church canons, doctrine, all of that stuff. Certainly more of a traditional kind of expression. As far as differences between Catholicism and Orthodoxy, in the Orthodox Church, like there's no pope, there's no kind of one person with kind of ultimate power. And in contrast with Protestantism, where, kind of the running joke is like, well, in Protestantism, like every pastor a little bit is kind of like a pope, kind of sets like the tradition or the rules or the guidelines or whatever, statement of faith or whatever it may be. Whereas in the Orthodox Church, there's been like the creed that's been passed down and more of tradition, and then Scripture kind of fits within that tradition as well. And understandably, like in the Protestant Church, like there's honestly like what I've seen so far, a lot more scriptural knowledge in the Protestant church as far as like memorizing verses and being like diving like really hardcore into scripture. And so you don't have as much of that in the Orthodox Church.
But you also don't have as many people finding their really weird interpretations of verses and building cults out of it.
That's certainly true. That's certainly true. Well, and it's like, if all you, and you know, this is not all that the Protestant church has, but like, if all you kind of have is scripture, you're going to like take and run with it. Like, you're going to like dive deep. And so like that, you know, that makes a lot more sense. Whereas in the Orthodox world, it's like so very like sacramentally, it's like, oh, well, there's scripture and there's the Eucharist and like baptism and, you know, marriage and this and that. And then there's like a lot. And so that's like one piece of it. But, you know, I do think it's important to like, you know, I think the church could stand to kind of dive like, or at least individually, people should like dive deeper into scripture. Myself, 100,000,000% included. So
yeah, and I know between Orthodoxy and Catholicism, I've heard it said that like Orthodoxy and Catholicism have a lot of similarities, but Orthodoxy just doesn't have like the Pope or a lot of the scandals. Priests can get married.
Right.
There's not the Crusades as much and things like that.
Well,
it's not flawless, but a lot less scandal from my understanding.
Yeah, I mean, and I think part of that is so like in the West, like Augustine played, you know, who's brilliant, but played a big role in kind of making the theology more, let me think of the term, like more, a little bit more kind of heady and intellectual, and perhaps a little bit less like about just like that daily kind of struggle or whatever. And then it got kind of more academic and kind of, a little bit more legalistic. Whereas in the Orthodox world, you don't see that legalism as much.
And correct me if I'm wrong again, because you're not an expert, but I'm even less of an expert.
I'm no expert.
But even when you say legalism, it seems like from what I've seen, it's like literally legality. Like so much of Western thought is based on like God as the judge and like we have offended God and there's this amount of sin that we
Christ had to like pay the price.
Yeah. Whereas the primary analogy in Orthodoxy of God is more a father than a judge and like bringing us, like showing us how back to the path of life as opposed to this big theological, you know, as someone like Richard Dawkins says, like, you know, did God kill himself to sacrifice himself to himself to pay himself for our sins?
Ridiculous.
And it's like this very weird legal analogy as opposed to, you know, we've kind of lost our way, and the point of Christianity being to find our way back to the path of life that Jesus showed the world, self-sacrifice and those kinds of things. But
yeah, no, exactly. Yeah, in the Orthodox Church, like the church is seen as a hospital. So it's like, you know, if you're looking around and you're like, man, this guy is real sick over here, like, you know, I'm not that bad. I'm not like him. But in the end, it's like, you're all sick. You're all in the hospital. Like you all need treatment of, you know, the sacraments and, you know, kind of walking along with God. But yeah, it's not this legal piece where it's like, you know, I mean, you certainly see that in like St. Paul when he talks about like atonement and like Christ, you know, Christ like paid the price and all of that. So not that that's like not true. It's more like, how is that like executed through like the theology? Is it like, you know, like in the Protestant world, it's more like sinners in the hands of an angry God and like very, very like punitive. And Catholicism too can get like very like punitive. But in the Orthodox Church, it's like, okay, like we've been expelled out of the garden. Like, how do we find the way back? But also like, we have even more than what was in the garden. Yes, Adam was like walking in the, you know, coolness of the day with God. But like now, I mean, you know, Christ has kind of paid that price, and like we can come into union with Christ in a way that wasn't even possible in the garden, which is like kind of mind blowing to think about. And man's fallen from like, you know, man is like, and this is what I love about kind of the Orthodox Church too, is man is seen as like his destiny was like priest of the cosmos, and like this and I mean like mankind, including woman as well, just like that's the function that we should be living out. And so through that, all that, that includes like all of creation, like all of created things. So that's all the animals, and like through man, everything is kind of assimilated together in a way that, starts this kind of redemptive process. Obviously it's like through God and through Christ and, through the Holy Trinity and all of that. But then compare that with like, people are killing each other. And it's like, dude, you were made in the image of God. You were made for like such a beautiful kind of height, from a spiritual and theological perspective. But like, here we are like arguing on like Black Friday or something. Like, like it's ridiculous. So yeah, it's kind of gives you more, at least for me, gives me more of that like holistic picture, and like kind of practical goals that I can personally kind of like shoot towards. But I mean, wherever you're at, like, I don't know, it's good. Like, as long as you're, on kind of the right path, or like you have like a semblance of like where you're going or whatever. So like, no disrespect to, anybody who's kind of trying to like grapple their way through all of that.
I know another big thing that struck me about Orthodoxy, and particularly Father John Atkinson, who was the priest before he retired at St. Nicholas's, where he would often answer questions saying, "I don't really know," and I never heard that from a spiritual leader.
Yeah,
and it was kind of refreshing, because growing up, I was very much a person who wanted to have all of my ideological ducks in a row and have an answer for everything.
Yeah.
And he'd, be like, "That's a real stumper. I don't know if I'm going to figure that one out." And and it's not in a super loosey-goosey way of like, whatever meaning you want something to have, but just genuinely, there's big questions that are hard to get to, and so I admired that humility to not always have to have an answer for something, which seems to be a more Eastern virtue in general. Like, a lot less, like, there's less, we don't, in the West, there's a lot of catechism and like books, and in Orthodoxy, it's more like the culture than like if I remember Father John was saying, if you want to learn about Orthodoxy, go to church. Like, it's not about reading a book or, like learning in your head. It's about experiencing the liturgy and smelling the incense and, hearing the chants and seeing all the paintings and like being with people and sharing food and all that kind of thing.
Yeah. Like you'll hear like, "Come taste and see," and I think that's originally from a hymn that's like, "Come taste and see that the Lord is good." I'm sure that's in scripture, but, it's experiential. And so that's why, like, with some of the newer like online movements, things get weird, because people can like stay behind a computer all the time, and then it's like, "Well, hey man, like, just come to church." And it's like, well, like, and so like you even get people now that are like, would call themselves like semi-experts or something on the church or theology or whatever. And it's like, okay, like, you've been part of the church for a couple months, or like maybe you visited like twice or something.
Yeah.
And it's like, I don't know. I think everybody means well, but it's certainly experiential, in that it's like, it's lived out, it's walked out. It's not this heady academic. In fact, I mean, there's even quotes from the saints and the church fathers that are like, man, like, if it's only an academic pursuit, or if it's too like, kind of mental in that capacity, then like you're like already down the wrong path. Not that that's looked down upon. It's just that like, it's more about coming into contact with God. And it's pretty simple, but like, we tend to, or at least I tend to like make it complex. So like when I first converted like 8 years ago, maybe 9 years ago, yeah, I did the same very thing. Like I bought all these books and I was reading, and that's great. But there's a certain point in which you have to step back and say, hey, like this was a great like kind of on ramp, and now you have to like live it out. So like, what does that look like? That looks like daily prayers. That looks like morning prayers. We really struggle with evening prayers because we have 4 children. But like having a prayer rule or a prayer life, like together as a family, individually, coming to church regularly. So it becomes like a part of your life. It's not this thing that you're just like adding on. And it's, you know, I think in the West too, like it can get kind of a little materialistic or a little like, oh, like I found this thing and now I'm like adding it on to like my existing life, like a piece of jewelry or clothing or something. But it's definitely deeper than that.
Yeah, it is very like embodied in the most literal sense of the word. Of there's so much you do with your body, even in a service.
Yeah,
like doing a cross and
yeah,
like walking up for communion,
the whole
and lighting the candle when you come in, and there's bowing and prostrations and things like that. And that was very new for me when I first started going and seeing like, oh, this is. It definitely felt weird at first.
Oh,
like,
yeah.
Upbringing, like, oh, but then, yeah, it came to be really comforting to just to like, oh, it's not just my mind participating; I'm physically participating in these things too. And which another thing I was reminded of with the whole humility and realizing the cap of your knowledge is because just 2 or 3 weeks ago, I ran into a friend at a coffee shop, and I have a long history with this friend. He'd been in Georgia for 9 months, and so I asked him something about his trip. And because before when he'd gone, well, let me go to the beginning of the story. So the same friend, maybe 7 years ago, I was sitting with at the university, and he was talking to some guy who was an international student from India, and this friend said to the Indian, so I know in India you guys believe that A, B, and C, and the guy said, I have no idea what you're talking about. and you could tell that this Christian guy had just read a bunch of apologetics books from Christians that don't really represent what people actually teach or believe. In the same way, there's a lot of misrepresentation of Catholicism or something like that. And so the same friend I see about a year ago, and he's prepping for a mission trip to Georgia. And I asked him, isn't Georgia like 80% Christian? And he was like, yeah, but it's, not the right kind of Christian.
Oh,
and
interesting.
It's Orthodox, Eastern Orthodox. And so I'd ask him, well, have you...
Oh, the country of Georgia. Okay, I'm
yes,
following.
Sorry.
No, you're good.
That was
you're
confusing.
Good. Yeah.
And so I'd ask him, well, there's an Orthodox church here. Have you...
Not the right type of Christian. Yeah.
Have you been there? And he said, no. And I said, oh, you should go. Have you ever been to any Orthodox church? And he said, no. So have you read any books about? He said, no. He's about to travel, and not to, it's easy again to see the speck in someone else's eye and not notice your own problems, but just having that was one of my biggest problems with the way the culture I was raised in was just this big lack of self-awareness or if you're educated on something, then maybe even then you can hardly have an opinion on something because there's just so much information in the world. But a lot of people are having really strong opinions with very little knowledge.
Well, yeah. Well, and I think that's the thing. It's like you don't know what you don't know, and that's difficult. It's kind of like the fish analogy of like a fish, swimming in water, doesn't know that there's water, or the water's always been around it, and it just is. So for us, we never thought about something like sola scriptura. So in the Protestant church, right, it's kind of only the Bible. There's kind of this pride, I guess. It's this is all that's needed. And so when you don't know that certain sacraments may have been thrown out or tossed by the wayside, or at the very least kind of super minimized, you don't really know. And so in his case. I'm sure he had no idea. Like he's like, oh, I'm going off to like a foreign land and like we're gonna like save souls or whatever. But it's good to have perspective. And yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, he might still feel like, okay, we got to like convert all these, all these Orthodox people are like their doctrine's messed up or they, I mean, there's certain things obviously that like the Orthodox Church thinks about the Protestant Church and the Protestant Church thinks about the Orthodox Church. And some of them are truly misrepresentations. Like, I've heard like, oh, you guys like pray to the saints and do all kinds of weird, like you like worship Mary and you do this and you do that. And a lot of that stuff theologically is just like not right at all. And it's like, dude, like let's have a conversation or like maybe do some research
which for you what brought you to Orthodoxy and like what sort of like meaning did you derive from that drew you in and thought, oh, this is worth becoming a part of and going to seminary for?
Yeah, man, that's a big question. So in a funny way, we were already kind of on a trajectory. So my wife's father is a Southern Baptist pastor. And so I grew up essentially nothing, just kind of, well, I grew up, I think there's a term for it now. It's like moralistic therapeutic deism.
Mm-hmm.
So this like kind of, and I don't fault my parents for it. That's all they had. And so like, kind of like be a good person. Like if you be a good person, then you'll go to heaven when you die.
Mm-hmm.
And like theologically, like there's a lot of like holes there. Like it's not, it's just, and it's called that because it's like moralistic, but it's therapeutic in that you're like, it's going to be okay, and a belief in God, but kind of this like separate God that's like, maybe spun everything into being, but that's like about it. Mm-hmm. And so, yeah, so that's how I was raised. My wife was raised in the Southern Baptist Church. So our trajectory as a couple went from traditional Southern Baptist to modern Southern Baptist, with like guitars and, more of like an intense kind of worship experience. And then from there, we were like, this is getting kind of weird. The Iraq War was happening. And we started reading a lot of Shane Claiborne and we're like, how do we feel about war? Like, and then I did some research and was like, okay, so the Southern Baptist group of churches, so the Southern Baptist Association, like essentially they had a document or something that was in support of the war in Iraq. And I wasn't super political, but I was like, okay, can a body of churches support a war? And then I started reading about just war theory, and I started like going down this rabbit hole of like, okay, like what does war mean in the context of church and God and the Bible and all of that? And so through that and through some other things, we kind of faded back on that church experience and then went to a non-denominational church that was essentially all like ex-Baptist, basically. And it was a little bit more traditional. We had communion every Sunday. That's typically not, and I would say you can't really say most Protestant churches because there's such a wide variety, right? In the Protestant world, you have everything from like,
High
Church of England, all the way to like Westboro Baptist or Pentecostal or like, God hates fags or whatever. Like you have like lots of like all kinds of stuff. And there's like 100,000 denominations or something.
Alex and I always joke about when we drive past a Pentecostal church in the country.
Yeah.
That to me is like one of the most frightening things because Pentecostals in the city have society to sort of like tether them. But like those ones out in the country, they're just doing their own thing and you get all the snake handling.
Like, well, I don't know if it's Jehovah's Witnesses, but there's one group where all of their churches have no windows.
Yeah, I think that's right.
And that always, I'm like, like aesthetically, I don't really agree with that. But also, like, are you trying to hide something? Like, this is a little.
But also, that's a lot of evangelicalism, not because of trying to hide something, but because you have
Yeah.
to be able to dim the lights. But I think there's such a loss of like, again, the physical stuff.
Right.
The way that I grew up, it was like everything that's physical doesn't matter in a sense. Like, that's not how it'd be put, but like, this is just
Right.
a functional building and this is just a functional world that'll
Well,
be burned up.
At
and-
best. And then
Yeah.
at worst, it's like your body is bad and sexuality is bad and like
yeah, like the
you're-
environment, like it's all gonna burn eventually anyway.
yeah,
so
let's
why
just
focus too
use up
much?
the resources. Let's burn the oil. you
Yeah, and
know?
it's not like people would say like, well, let's just burn all the oil and give the middle finger to the earth. But it'd be
Right.
like, this shouldn't be a priority because like
right.
the
Christ
all
is
gonna
coming
end.
back,
Yeah.
tomorrow or whatever. Yeah, exactly. But yeah, so our trajectory went from all the way to like more of a traditional experience, communion every Sunday, like trying to get back to like early churchish stuff. That church kind of looked at the book of Acts as like, okay, here's how we're going to try and do things. And then, we moved up to Northwest Arkansas, and we looked at more conservative churches, more liberal churches, and all of them were like caricatures. It was all like the liberal church was like, they even had a couple of like Orthodox like icons on the wall, but it was like very loosey-goosey, very much like a de-emphasis on sin. Didn't seem to be taken seriously. And then in the more conservative experience, those churches were more like
only focus on sin.
yeah, that, or like it was all like the worship show, like, hey brother, like, we're gonna have fog machines and like, oh, just wait till you see our worship. And I was like, yeah, I used to be in the worship band, like I hear you, but like that's not really why I'm here.
Huh.
Like I'm here to like meet with God. Like that's really what we care about. Everything else is kind of external. Like obviously, you do meet with God through worship, but like not, if everything starts to kind of feel in like the world, then it's not salty anymore. And so it's like, it just felt kind of too worldly. So that wasn't right either. And so our buddy at the time was posting about, I think on Facebook or somewhere, about the Orthodox Church. And we're like, ooh, like he's doing like quotes from the Desert Fathers and like real kind of meaty stuff. And so kind of asked him, he's a priest now, but he was going through seminary, and asked him about the church. But yeah, fast forward, I was asked, personally, my experience, I was asked to serve at the altar. First time I served, a bishop was present, a bishop was coming into town, and they needed help. And so Tom Salem, who's now the godfather of our children, was like, hey Scott, have you ever thought about serving behind the altar? He put his arm around me, and I was like, why no, Tom? I don't think I have. And then I'm like, yeah, I can try that out. And super intense, like it was like being inside of a Swiss clock, and things are moving and things are happening, and I'm just trying to stay out of the way. But from that experience on, I was like, man, this is a place that I want to be. Like for whatever reason, I felt this draw to it. And I was a jerk about it. When I first started serving, I was like mean to my wife and like, I have to do this and blah, blah, blah. And like, I have to go get there early. And, but I think it came out of this, like this zealousness that I was feeling. I didn't understand what I was feeling. And only now do I realize like, man, that was like this kind of magnetic attraction to serving at the altar. But also this like magnetic attraction of like loving people and just like wanting to serve others. And as far as seminary goes, really pre-COVID, really started feeling kind of that call. And, I was like, am I having a midlife crisis? Am I just unhappy with my job? Am I, really had to search inside and be like, where is this coming from? And even now, like, I can't I can't like put my finger on it and be like, this is it. You know, some guys you hear about like, oh, I've known since I was 7 years old and all of that. That's not me. Other guys, you know, I don't know, maybe they have a St. Paul moment where they're like knocked back and they have like a vision of whatever. Also not me. But yeah, kind of the piece of scripture that's like the still small voice of God where like you feel that kind of like gentle tug. I would say that's me. But yeah, before COVID hit, started feeling that, and we got real close to jumping to seminary, like pretty immediately. And I called some of the seminarians, some of the guys with kids, and that were married, and they're like, "Man, it's pretty rough. Like, I don't know." And so I decided, okay, like I need to make sure that I even enjoy it. Like how can I even think about doing this? Like, I don't want to start it and then I'm like, I don't even enjoy doing this. So, started the 3-year program at House of Studies, and, yeah. And so through that's basically been my discernment process for the priesthood, and kind of entering ministry. And then also trying to figure out between like the diaconate and the priesthood, because those are 2 separate kind of tracks. For people that don't know, the diaconate is typically not like a paid like position. It's like you still have a full-time job. You're not like moving off to seminary necessarily. But with the priesthood, you definitely need an MDiv degree. And you need like a lot of training as far as that, and you know, training for deacons too. But
yeah. So what's your end goal, or what you're leaning towards? Like, are you aiming to enter the priesthood, or?
Yeah. So fast forward to now, I, in the midst of completing my thesis, met with our local bishop, you know, kind of got his approval. Him and my wife met, you know, well, first of all, this has been like a 3 to 5 year long journey. So I met with multiple priests, multiple people, trying to kind of figure this out, and like, man, where am I? Is this the right thing? Am I crazy? I even had a moment of like extreme self-doubt, and, you know, obviously still full of doubt, but, my bishop had me read the book On the Priesthood by St. John Chrysostom. And within that, it's an amazing book, but within that book, he writes several things. You know, one is like the priest must be like the angels. I was like, oof, that's pretty tough. Even tougher, he goes so far as to say that the road to hell is paved with the skulls of the priests, and the torches that light the way to hell are the skulls of the bishops. I was like, wow, this is very intense. And so that whole book is like very intense. And then
real quick, it's noteworthy of saying that I wondered if there's a direct correlation between that quote and a famous quote that I heard a lot growing up from Sinners in the Hands of the Angry God of, I forget his name, Jonathan Edwards, saying that the road to hell is paved with the skulls of unbaptized infants.
Oh, wow.
Because there's the whole
that's
original
dark.
sin, and like, which is another big difference between Orthodoxy. But that, we can get into that later. But anyway, I just thought that was worth noting, because it's like a difference. It's hard to describe a different culture, because it's not just like, oh, maybe the way that the different kind of churches I grew up around, it's like you switch around this doctrine or that doctrine between all the different denominations, but they're largely the same.
Right.
But Orthodoxy, going from Protestantism to being around Orthodox churches, it was a massive culture shift and like mindset shift, and like in a fundamental way.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Well, and I think, you know, so that freaked me out, obviously. But to your point, you have to see it in context. And so, you know, every Orthodox priest has a stole, and so on that stole, it's used for various, you know, purposes, but, you know, in confession and different things. And if you see it on a priest, it's you know he's a priest. But it has fringe at the bottom, and so all the little fringes each one represents a person that he, cares for, essentially, kind of symbolically. And so, yeah, so I think in the Orthodox Church, there's this idea of like, look, like, at the end of the day, people are responsible for themselves. But, the priest and the clergy certainly have this great, huge responsibility and obligation, whether it's a sermon or homily, or giving someone bad confession advice or something. Like, you have a part to play in the lives of the flock. And if you fumble it, or if you just don't care, or if you're too lax, or maybe even too strict, let's be real, like, you can damn yourself and, like, send people down a bad path. And so, not that I probably wouldn't say you're responsible for other people's salvation or anything. And the Orthodox Church, again, views salvation differently than kind of the Protestant world. In the Orthodox Church, it's more like, we've been saved, we're being saved, we will be saved. It's more of this like participatory, like, it's not like, oh, I said the prayer like 25 years ago, and I accepted Jesus into my heart, and now I'm washed in the blood, and now I'm good. It's not so much that. It's more like, look, like, in humility, like, I pray for that, but but at the same time, like the thief will I confess thee, remember me, O God, in thy kingdom. So it's like, your mind, you should be the thief on the cross with Christ. Like, you should be crucified and be like, dude, I don't know. Like, I don't know. Like, I have assurance. Like, I think St. Paul talks about like blessed assurance. Like, there is assurance in kind of walking in the way of Christ. However, like, you can't like rest on your laurels and just be like, yeah, oh, I'm good or whatever. So, and that comes with like, faith and works. Like, there has to be works. Like, you need both. So
yeah, more of a like path than a single moment.
Yeah, and I think most Protestants too don't believe that, like, oh, I'm saved and now I can just like take it easy or whatever. So I think that's a little bit of a false kind of condemnation or whatever from if it's the Orthodox Church on Protestantism or whoever. But there is kind of this like a little bit of an anti-works, or maybe a lot of kind of an anti-works kind of mentality. But
yeah, which I find that whole conversation between faith and works to be super annoying because it's like, you argue in circles, like, you're kind of saying the same thing.
Yeah.
You're just saying it in different ways, and there are people who are saying something like unless someone is saying you literally pay me like in the 15th century or whatever to have your sins cleansed and then you get to heaven.
Right.
Like, okay, that's a problem. But most people are saying, most Christians on whatever side of the spectrum are saying, like, yes, you need to have faith, and yes, you need to be walking the walk and talking the talk.
Yeah, exactly. Like, that's all it is. Yeah. Well, and similarly annoying to me is like the faith and science argument. I'm like, yeah, that's ridiculous. Like, don't even like waste my time with that. Like, it's pretty evident like how that all pans out. But yeah.
Which what would you say, which this can be related to your path, seminary and everything, or just something totally different, but what's been giving you the most excitement in your day-to-day life? Like, when you wake up, what's been getting you hyped to get out of bed?
Man, that's a good question. I would say, several things. Like, I'm a pretty simple guy. Even so, there's like practical things, and then there's like big, grand, kind of picture things. But like, just a good cup of coffee, like, waking up in the morning and being like, wow, like, I try and be grateful for everything. Like, I could die tomorrow, and obviously my family would be sad, but like I could die tomorrow and I'd be like, okay, like, I did it. Like I did it. Obviously I have goals currently on the table that I want to accomplish, but yeah. So yeah, I mean, a good cup of coffee, just taking every day, one day at a time. Um, my family, obviously, like, kind of going day by day, like, just, I don't know. Like, I was thinking about it recently and you just have to keep going. Like, I feel like, like I've had people in my life that have like, kind of gone by the wayside or they've gotten wrapped up in like, gosh, I have so many friends now, just a recent one too, a recent couple we used to go to church with, that are like divorced, or the guy now likes guys, the girl now likes girls, the or this person over here commits suicide, or this person over here just bombs out in some kind of other way, or if it's not alcohol, it's drugs, if it's not drugs, it's depression. And it's like, man, like you just have to keep going. And obviously, like, the big command, like love Christ, love your neighbor. You just, if you, and I try to tell my kids this and they look at me like I'm crazy, but like if everything that you do can be done for Christ or like in the name of Christ, like that's how to live. So it's like, hey, like we're doing this right now. This might like bless someone. I don't know. Or if every interaction you have can boost someone else, can lead someone else towards Christ. And I've seen that. Like I was talking to somebody on the phone the other day and they were going through like at the same time, they were going through the Taco Bell drive-through and they ordered and they got their food and they made some comment about like, oh, I see you here all the time. And he like joked back and then said something really positive to them. And I'm like this is it. Like one little positive interaction. And Elder Thaddeus in the Orthodox Church talks about this. He's got a great book, but he talks about how like one good deed or one bad deed almost like ripples out. And it sounds so new agey. And that's what's funny is I know people that have read this book and they're like, oh, it's comes off too new agey for me. But like in the Orthodox world, like that, it ripples out and cosmically, like even into the universe. So like if I punch you in the face right now, you're like, oh man, I hate you. Like, what have you done? And so now we're enemies. And then maybe you're in a bad mood. You go to dinner tonight and you're like, ugh. And you like say something mean to your kid and then your kid's sad and then they do bad. Like it's like on down the line. And so I don't know.
Yeah. And that's like, New Agey can be a loaded term because I remember in Orthodoxy y'all use the word energy a lot, and that and I read through a lot of the early Christian writings, and several of them talk about Mother Earth. No big deal saying a term like that, and not in like in a weird way, but just things. I think that's mostly a Southern culture thing that people get really uptight about. If something sounds just the faintest bit New Age or it's yoga or whatever, it ain't Christian.
Yeah.
And I had a friend who was a pastor for a while, a Pentecostal pastor too. But he said you got to be wary of Eastern religions, and the irony in that statement of like Christianity was started in the Middle East,
right?
Like in the heart of it. But people have sort of think of it as a very Western thing, and it's become its own thing in the West, which has done a lot of great things.
Oh yeah,
charity and I mean, there's the whole debate between probably the biggest split between East and West culturally, not just religiously, but the West being more individualistic and the East being more like the communal and the overall society. And there's a debate to be had on like how much should people tend to prioritize their own individual happiness over what their duty sometimes, and sometimes you got to just like suck it up to some extent and like do what's right. And on the other end, I'm sure there's people who are doing everything that they do for their family and for their boss and for, everything for those around them other than what they genuinely want to be doing.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. Yeah, there's certainly a difference. Like, residency was the term I was looking for before. When I went to my residency at the Antiochian House of Studies, talked to a lot of the guys from the Middle East there, and it was funny because they were talking about like growing up with like civil war and all kinds of struggles. I heard stories of like they'd have to get up every morning and they'd have to take this big, like, I don't know if it was buckets or tanks or whatever, but they'd have to like walk for miles to get their water and their bread for the day. And hopefully they would have it and they would get it and then they would walk miles back. And, as this like privileged Westerner, I was like, oh man, like that must have been so hard. Like, oh, and they were actually like, no, they were like, we had our family, we had our faith. They were like, actually coming to the US, like essentially they said enough things that they basically probably still see, or at least did see, the US as almost like, kind of like morally bankrupt and just like people, that here you have like the epidemic of loneliness. You have, personally, like my parents are divorced. My sister got divorced. Like families are kind of...
Everyone's on a bunch of pills.
Everyone's on, pharmaceuticals. I read a stat recently that talked about how in the US, like, what was it, like 30 million people or something? I'm going to butcher the stat, but like millions of people are on like steroids too, to like get jacked. And so, but to them, they had strife in a physical sense, but it wasn't that big of a deal because they had like what truly matters. Then they come here and they're like, wow, like we still have what truly matters, but like, what are you guys doing? Like you have all this material wealth, but spiritually, you're bankrupt. So
it reminds me of Alex and I spent part of our honeymoon on the Rosebud Reservation because we have some friends there, and I remember one of them talking about how all these charity organizations come in and that once a charity had come in and was wanting to update all their houses in this neighborhood and give them all these nice things, and the people just didn't want it. They were like, this is our, like, we don't need that. We don't want it. Like, we like our houses as they are.
Yeah.
Like, because it would, I forget what it was, but it was going to just, tweak something. And that to them, just their way of life and their community and their culture was way more valuable than having nicer things. And it's just hard to fathom for a lot of, middle-class Americans.
Yeah. Well, I think that's the thing too. And I think that's part of, this is like pretty scathing, but I've watched some videos. My wife has watched some videos too recently about how like, basically like, not to hate on boomers, but like there was this, either our parents or maybe even their parents, in American society, there was such, like progression and fruitfulness and from a monetary standpoint and just like materialism and all that, kind of this peak. And then now for me being a millennial, it's definitely not the same situation. Like my parents had like a nest egg. They're like, oh, we've saved this money and we bought our first house for, I don't know. When we lived in Jacksonville, that house in the 90s, or no, I think it was like
3 nickels and a cheese stick.
Yeah, exactly. I think it was like $30,000 or something. But things have infinitely gotten more expensive and inflation and all of that. But yeah, generationally, there's certainly a difference. But I think, and some people have pointed to that whole like, oh, what's the little cycle? Like, good times equal soft men, and then soft men equal bad times and all of that, which I think there's truth to that. Like, we've had such prosperity that now, when we hit those hard times, like we got to make sure we're like, we're doing like what matters. And for me, kind of transitioning out of advertising into more of the church world, like, it's not this dramatic thing of like making sure I'm on the right side of history or anything like that. That sounds way too dramatic, but it is like, dude, like we don't have a lot of time here on this earth. So how are you going to spend it? Like, what are you going to do? Are you going to like piss it away? Are you going to,
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah. I've actually currently been working on, I wanted to be part of the podcast, but I've been in talks with my high school about giving a talk to the kids about like why we can be excited about the future. Cause I think people have a very grim outlook towards the future for very understandable reasons.
Yeah.
But at the same time, there's so many incredible things that are happening that people don't realize because all you see on the news is
It's like
doom and gloom.
Right.
And I was going somewhere with that, but
doom and gloom, kind of thinking about your future.
what did you just said?
I don't want to like just kind of crap it away, or just like you want to live like intentionally.
Yeah. And yeah, so what you were saying about like not wanting to waste your life, that's how I felt recently when I'm doing a bunch of picture and video editing. like I don't have time to write these things that could encourage people or all these other projects,
right?
Because I'm getting these Amber.
Is it the same guy? And
alerts.
Yeah,
he's in Morrilton, which is like 2 hours away. So I'm not
I know. I'm like,
we're getting it.
Why do we? I can't silent it either. Okay.
Anyway,
yeah.
Of just like I want to outsource a lot of my editing because I've thought I only have one life, and every day it makes me more and more mad that I'm just sitting behind a computer working on videos. That
I mean, that's fair.
And it's not. I shouldn't be. I'm not at the point where I'm like super angry and bitter about it because it's like, okay, but I know I would get there. Like I'm seeing the trajectory. Like this is not what I want to do with my life. I would rather pay someone to take on some of this,
do that,
so that I can like have time to do these other projects that will, in my mind, be more meaningful and lasting. And so I'm with you on like we've only got one life. Like go for it, do what you can.
But that being said, though, there's a pendulum, right? So like, and I think this is what I had difficulty with. Like on the one hand, and I can only speak about my experience and my family and stuff, but like my dad was in the Air Force for, almost 20 years. Then after that, he worked for Remington Arms. My mom was a nurse, her whole life until she retired. They're both retired now. But it's this funny thing. Like you can be all like, what am I going to do with my life? And like, I want to make it count and all of that. And I think it's genuinely important to do so. Especially if you're looking at like, ministry or humanitarian aid or whatever. But I do feel like there's a spectrum. Like, like my dad got drafted, when he was, I think it was before age 18. I think it may have been 17 or 18, or maybe it had to be 18. My dad got drafted. They let you choose what branch at the time. So he opted to go to the Air Force. Didn't want to be on front lines in Vietnam, and I don't blame him. As far as like Marines or the Army, because it was a kind of a meat grinder, and so ended up doing that for a long time. And so I think it's important to like ask those big questions, but you have to balance it out with like, at the end of the day, like you also have to just like do what you got to do to get by, and like you got to make money. And like did he or like maybe our grandfathers or my grandfathers and grandmothers, like did they ask themselves those questions? Like did they have like and I hate the word privilege because it's like so loaded now and it's like weird and horrible, but did they have the opportunity or the privilege to like even ask those questions? Like, are we and this is something I wrestle with. Like, I do think it's important, especially with like the onset of AI and all these like kind of big existential things that are happening in the world today, to ask those questions. But there's like some kind of blue collar thing like seated within me that's like, at the end of the day, like is the guy like working at, McDonald's or whatever, like, is he like, what am I doing with my life?
Uh-huh.
Like, oh, like,
Oh,
or is it just like, dude, you just got to get out there and like grind
yeah.
and like,
The world
like,
would not be a good place if everyone had like the mindset that I have, because so many things would not get done. But it's it's the balance of like we need
Right.
people.
you have to have, yeah, you have to have the dreamers. So the dreamer, like what I've seen in like kind of the entrepreneurial space, like the dreamer, you have the startup founder, right?
Mhm.
The founder is like the dreamer. He has the dream. He's, maybe a little bit, a little kooky or a little like flighty. And he takes the flag and he like sinks it into the ground and says like, but there's like inspiration there. And then typically in startups, that guy sticks along for the ride for a little bit, but then you have more of like a like type A,
Yeah.
like, okay, now like we're gonna move these glasses and the
Uh-huh.
bottle's gonna go here and like
Uh-huh.
we're doing XYZ. And so yeah, I think there's a balance.
Uh-huh.
Like you need the dreamers and the artists and all of that, certainly.
But you definitely need the people who just like
Yeah.
are content to
Right.
like I'm glad that all these things in society work because there's people just manning it and they enjoy it well enough. Like,
Yeah.
they're not hating their life.
And maybe they do, I don't know. I mean, maybe I think everyone to a certain extent is like, man, like I was destined for more than this. But that's also like, since the fall, like, you're all of it, we're all going to have like a place inside of us that's like, something's not right. Like I wasn't made for this. And it's like, yeah, you weren't made for this.
Mhm.
Like you were made for something much more. And so like, but you have to figure out, at least like for me, like I have to figure out like that kind of discrepancy is like always going to be there.
Mm.
But like, yeah, I don't know. Yeah, it's a
Yeah.
tough thing. So it's tough because you don't want to. Yeah, I just think about my parents, like my dad was working like 12-hour shifts, like
Uh-huh.
pushing bullets around at Remington. My mom's like, she's had like a hip replacement and both knees replaced, and like, like growing up, like she wasn't like, is this what I should be doing?
Yeah.
It was just like, hey mom, are we having pizza tonight? And she's like, yep, here's pizza, or like, here's, I don't know. So yeah, I think it's tough. It's like a wrestle within myself.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's always important to have like immense respect for what's come before.
Yeah, that
'Cause it's
too.
like they've got their flaws, the
Yeah.
older generation, and I mean millennials, we've got our issues too.
Yeah.
And just trying to be self-aware and say, I'm thankful for this, but this seems to have not panned out well, and let's change that. And
Yeah.
same of like we can learn from like, man, this thing that us young folk are doing does not seem to be
Yeah.
producing good results. Maybe there is a thing or two to learn from the elderly.
Yeah.
I like the question, what for you, what would it mean to have made it in life? Knowing that, like you had said, that you could die today and
Yeah.
you feel like you did it, but ultimately, what would you feel like where you're at your peak?
At your peak. I mean, I feel like I have made it already. I don't know. I mean, I think, yeah. I mean, for me, I never expected I would have 4 kids, and I don't know, like maybe it's a guy thing, but I didn't have some great vision. I mean, I always wanted to get married or expected I would be married, and probably have kids someday. But to have, I mean, my wife and I have been married for 18 years. Got 4 kids. We're not rich, but we're like financially getting by. The only way we're able to go to seminary is because of the equity in our house. So we're gonna be like living on that money. But yeah, I mean, I'm a pretty simple person. I mean, I love good coffee. I love like, vices and like the finer things in life and all that. But I mean, I don't know. I feel like I'm already there. But yeah, as far as making it, I mean, that's and I don't mean this about you, but like that's such a weird question. It's
Yeah.
similar to like what do you do? Like I feel like in American culture, there's this idea that like your identity is completely found in your job or some kind of like caricature of yourself. I don't know, maybe I would change my answer, like making it uh certainly in the Orthodox Christian world, is like constantly progressing towards God. I mean, and eventually, probably not on this plane, but probably, after we're done here, it's a continual kind of like movement towards God. So I think for me, making it would be that continual progression, and you see that in the saints. And there's a great quote from Saint Silouan the Athonite that says, ignore two thoughts. One thought says, you're doomed, and I'm butchering it, but one thought says you're doomed, you're evil, you're never going to be saved. Right? And then the other thought says, like, you're a saint, you're, you've made it, you're good to go. And it's like, flee both of those thoughts. So, but the idea is, I believe, and I feel like the church believes, that you have to believe that sainthood is possible. And it's not like this ego trip. It's not this, it's just in humility, one step after the other, like trying to progress on the path of Christ in a way that, you think about parenting, like your parents parented a certain way, maybe the way that we're parenting will, be 3% like better than like how we were raised, or maybe I can be 7% less of, a mean guy than, I was 10 years ago or something. Like, and it's not just this moral thing either. I think it's growing closer with Christ, kind of along the path, and believing that it's possible, and it is possible. I mean, you see it, like there are people that I'm not going to call out, but like there are people in my life right now that in my book, like they're saints, like they just are. I think they demonstrate a level of spiritual maturity and a level of, they're not perfect people, but there's like a level of seriousness and spiritual maturity and, like in their lives that like I want to emulate. And so, yeah, I think that for me is the ultimate goal. And not in this ego way, and not in an individualistic way either, because that's the thing, like in the lives of the saints, like they're never writing about themselves, or they're never like, it's not this self-focused thing. And so, yeah, I think that is the goal in the Orthodox Church. It's called theosis. But yeah, union with God, and in that, interestingly, you see, so that's why, like, in depictions of the saints that are like holding bears or like a bird, like there's a story of, like we just celebrated a couple of weeks ago, Saint Kevin, an Irish saint, and it says that he like opened his hands and like was in prayer for so long that a bird like landed and like built a nest in his hand, like while he was praying. Is it factual? Is it like a beautiful illustration? I don't know, but the idea being that like, kind of walking in those footsteps, and that it's possible. Because if you don't think it's possible, either in your head or in your heart, like it's just not going to happen. If you convince yourself that you're worthless, or if you convince yourself that, God doesn't love you, or that you're too bad of a person, all throughout scripture from like David all the way down, like God takes these messed up people and he takes the most messed up people a lot of times and turns them into people that he uses. One of the recent verses in church, it's like 2 or 3 Sundays ago, it was the Sunday of the blind man. And so, according to the church fathers, he had no eyeballs. And so in the scene in scripture, like Christ, like, takes his spittle or spit and combines it with mud and kind of rolls it around and like puts it on his eyes. Some of the church fathers are almost like he's like making his eyes, and he like, puts it on him and he's healed. And so, but what's interesting about that story is in the beginning, it talks about how, the people are all chatting, right? And they're like, well, who did this? Like, what happened? And it's like, okay, he was blind. Well, whose fault was it? Was it his fault, or was it the fault of his parents? Because, in that context, it was like, oh, well, he sinned, his parents had sinned.
Mhm.
That's why he was blind, because of some kind of like, I don't know if you want to call it like generational sin or whatever. And so Christ says, no, actually, he was born blind, so like the glory of God could be manifested within him. And so like if you think about that, it's like, man, like if we're all, if we all have these broken parts of our lives and these like cracks or trauma or whatever you want to call it is just a place where we can like manifest God's glory like out of our lives, then that's a game changer. Because that's basically saying like, no matter what you've gone through or who you are, like it's possible for you to get there, whether that's like physical infirmity, like blindness, or whether that's, mental issues or on the spectrum, or I don't know, whatever it may be, or like horrible sinful life in the past. And now you've kind of turned your life back over. But yeah, I would say it's possible. And so I think that's ultimately, the goal is to becoming more like Christ, union with God, but not in some like cheesy, like,
Yeah.
like self-focused way where you're like, I'm, to where it's selfless too. And you don't like toot your horn. And you just like, just don't be a jerk.
Yeah.
Like,
It's a good starting.
don't be me, like, just, I don't know, like, in controlling, like, I don't know, I feel like Proverbs talks about, like, control your emotions, like, it's so hard, like, and I'm, like, the worst, like, like, I was weed eating, I got so mad, recently, I was weed eating, and my wife has these garden beds, and I weeded them, my weed eater's half broken, and I don't know how to fix it.
I mean, doesn't that mean it's half fixed?
I mean, yeah, that's true. That's true. It's half broken, it half works, and I'm weed eating, and the cord keeps like shooting off. It's not an automatic feed. I have to feed the stuff. Why I bought one like that, I don't know. It was cheaper. And I got so mad that like I like threw it. I was just like, I'm done, and I like threw it, and I'm like, man, I'm just like a little child, like. So that's the thing, like you think, I don't know, like on the one hand you're asking all these big questions of like, why am I here, and on the other end, like you're like, we have these like animalistic, like I just want to like flip this table and like knock all the cameras down because like life's not fair, or like so
I've had some very similar experiences that have really surprised me, because I'm like, man, this is exactly what a kid would do when you're throwing a tantrum.
Yeah.
I'm 31, like, yeah. And Also, what do you think is something that people focus too much on, just in general in life, and then vice versa, like that they don't focus enough on? So you can take them one at a time.
Focus too much on. I should probably ask myself what I focus too much on. Instead of other people, that's probably makes more sense. I mean, for me personally, I'm pretty pleasure driven, and so I definitely focus on the pursuit of pleasure. So like whether that's like good food or drink or this or that. Not a big sports guy. So thankfully but I am getting into soccer actually, and so that could be a problem later on. Yeah, I think asking kind of the questions, deeper questions, like questioning things more, maybe focusing on, like what's behind the day to day and like day to day interactions, day to day, in my brief kind of stint managing someone at where I'm working at right now, I tried to always like care about her more than the company or the work, like try and care about people as people. And so I feel like, yeah, I feel like in America and in general, like people get so divided over like politics or this or that. And so, maybe focusing more on like seeing where people are coming from. Yeah, and trying to not be too kind of pleasure driven. And as far as not being focused on enough, I mean, certainly like Christ and like the things of God, in any like denomination or jurisdiction or whatever. And even if you're not Christian, like trying to, maybe you start with like goodness or like virtue. But yeah, trying to focus on the things that matter, not being so self-focused, which, yeah, I mean, I'm certainly materialistic. I mean, I like bought something on Amazon like an hour ago or whatever. I was like, I need boots. Like,
Yeah.
yeah, I would say, yeah.
All those are solid answers.
Yeah.
And I usually like to wrap up with just a practical challenge, like something that people can take all this information and say, okay, what can I do with this? Like if you just wanted to give a challenge that would make people more well-rounded, compassionate, educated on something, maybe whether that's reading a book or do this thing with your kids or I don't know, just anything.
Man, that's tough.
It doesn't have to be the challenge to end all challenges.
Yeah.
Like something.
I mean, I would say like, I don't know, ask big questions. Like, don't be satisfied with surface level, even like surface level conversation or, yeah. And then just, gosh, I would say like just love one another. But yeah, I don't know. We try and say this in our family and it doesn't always work, but like if we all kind of help each other or kind of pick up the slack, I think Acts talks about like there was no need because like everybody took care of each other and it was this beautiful picture of working together. I think that's really important, especially with the election coming up. We can get so polarized and like tribalistic, and this might sound kind of conspiracy theory, but like that's like I feel like that's a little bit by design, because if we're all over here like arguing and like, oh well, like my favorite color is purple, like oh my favorite color is blue, and then meanwhile like you have these people over here, during COVID we saw the most massive transfer of wealth in the history either in the US or the history of the world.
Yeah.
My company included. So massive transfer of wealth, but yet no one wants to talk about that. Everyone wants to talk about politics. Like no one wants to talk about like, the shrinking middle class.
Yeah.
Or even like right now in the Orthodox world, there's a clergy crisis. In the next 5 years, there needs to be, I think 115 new priests. And right now the seminaries all combined are spitting out 30 candidates that are eligible every year. So there's a huge kind of discrepancy there. So I don't know. Yeah, I think trying to kind of get past the noise and trying to deal with or think about kind of the things that truly matter and how we're all getting kind of like squished a little bit through various like forces. It's not all like the government or whatever, but like I don't know.
Yeah, a lot of it's human nature of like like the everyone has their opinion on something like the trans women and bathrooms, but to me it's like this is such a tiny issue that everyone's having all these debates and conversations when, like you said, there's so many people just struggling to survive, or not survive, but like make enough to meet their basic needs, and the depression and the like children's health and like all these kinds of things that are really declining in these more existential issues, and we're focused on these trees,
like tiny, and it might not be a trivial thing, but it's like all focus goes there when it's like, okay, what do we all have in common? Like, well, like, we all have like our own, deficiencies, or like maybe, the government's got their boot on our neck, or like whatever it may be, like, trying to find those commonalities and like working together. And
so how might you give a little hands and feet to that? Like you saying like something that someone could say, I did this or I did not do this. 'Cause, it's easy to say like be more curious, or I forget how you worded it, but like be more like question things more. So what's like just a simple thing someone could do that could like be a tangible step towards that?
Yeah, I mean, I would say, like, I think you had the point earlier that was around the guy going to Georgia and like didn't really know about the Orthodox Church. And then, so I think like just expanding your boundaries and saying, okay, like it's kind of uncomfortable, but like I'm going to learn about, the Protestant Church or Catholicism or this or that. Like you don't know what you don't know, like until you kind of break out of those bounds and experience it. And it's not always just like head knowledge. Probably most of the time it's not just head knowledge. And so I know you guys have done a lot of traveling. So like traveling, just like you see all kinds of things, and that helps you broaden your horizon. Like we've got some family members who lived in like Palestine and in the Middle East and different areas for years. And so like they think about things differently. So when I, kind of want to dig into that subject, like I'll talk to them and be like, oh, okay, wow. Like you were like boots on the ground over there. So like, what you're talking about. So I think like doing research or like kind of trying to expand maybe get, this is a thing about, I think this is something that like they say about sermons or whatever. You're supposed to afflict the comfortable and comfort the afflicted. And so I think a little bit of affliction for the sake of like growing is like a good thing. And
yeah, I might piggyback off that and just give the challenge, because most my massive listener base of 50 subscribers on YouTube, but most people have never been to an Orthodox church, whether they're Christian or not. And I think it's an experience. I think everybody should, spend time with all sorts of different people and just to like learn. It's America. It's a melting pot. And so I'd give the challenge to find an Orthodox church in your area and just visit it. I'm not like an apologist or like a anything like that, but just it's something I think every everybody should experience just to become more knowledgeable about the world around them and the culture around them. And Western civilization is built on Eastern Christianity, and
Right.
so it's a very educational experience. It's a very it's just a very spiritual experience, which sounds hokey, but like I distinctly remember walking in the first time, and it was winter, so it was already dark because it was in the evening, and there's the candles and the incense and the chants, and it's so beautiful. And I just thought, wow, this feels so not just feels spiritual and like a new age way, but like there's some people are trying to get at something here,
Right.
and that's not something I really experienced as much the way I grew up. It was a very sacred place, so I
Right.
would just encourage people
Yeah.
check out an Orthodox church.
I mean, obviously, I would agree.
Uh-huh.
Going into ministry and all that, God willing. But yeah, I mean, certainly, there's an element to your point of reverence and just focusing on Christ, and it, all those things haven't been like stripped away. Like, and you might go in as a Protestant, you might go in and be like, ooh, this is like kind of weird, or like, ooh, this is like feels a little bit like Catholicism. Like, I was like taught like that's not good or whatever.
Even
but-
though, like, in a lot of ways, I've heard that theologically, Catholicism is more similar to Protestantism
Yeah.
than to Orthodoxy, because they,
Yeah,
they kind of one came from the other.
Right.
And,
it's true.
yeah, which that'd be another fun podcast to just like get into. Because I don't. The goal of this is to be more like positive and encouraging, but I think there is a lot of encouraging, and just like not figuring out who's right, but which it's almost like as a scientist, like which idea or theology actually brings about more life in the world and more flourishing and abundance and genuine connection and all that.
That's interesting.
Any final thoughts or
thoughts? Man, yeah, I would say pray for me. If you pray, or if you send good vibes, whatever that looks like. But yeah, I think, expand your horizons. Yeah, visit Orthodox Church. If you're already Orthodox, visit, Catholic Church or Coptic Church or whatever it may be. I think it's important. Get out there, travel. Yeah, go nuts.
Yeah. Well, thanks for chatting.
Yeah, it's been great.
Until next time.
Yeah, ta-ta.